Hello, everybody. Welcome back today. Uh, Before I do anything, I'm just wanting to chill and watch some YouTube and see what happens while some things load in the background. I would like a 100-year-old workshop if, you know, didn't have any issues. It was like maybe like $2,000.
Although it doesn't look like it, that is apparently 10 tons of Type 1 MOT. And I wanted half of it on this side of the building and half on the other, but because the lorry was too big, it couldn't make it to the other side of the building. So I've got to barrow probably around
Very
5-6
British.
tons, either through the building or around the building.
Yeah, very British, you know? Alright. Gosh dang now it. Shrink. Shrink. No. And now I need to shrink. Gosh dang it. I think that will work. Let's see. Yeah, that's better. Here I am. Cool. Very British, like I was saying. Um, Man, this guy's like, for a 100-year-old place, it has like 2 to 3 feet of dirt just covering everything. Which I guess makes sense. It is snowing here. Testing 1 2 3. Testing. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. There we go. Yep. Got the lip sync working again, kind of. Not having fun at all doing that, you know? Honestly, I bet it would shake your arms off. Hmm. Oh, I'm guessing that's a driveway. Um, Once this is over, I'm gonna get to my 3D printing as normal. The regularly scheduled 3D prints. It's gonna have to put some rain gutters on this place.
In the next episode, I'll be completely renovating the woodshed, emptying out heaps of junk, getting rid of the monster ivy, and replacing the roof before filling it up with wood for future projects.
That was quick. I'm going to go and
Welcome back to the Derelict Workshop renovation
stuff. I'll be
series.
right back
So
to
far,
grab a
I have
water.
cleared out decades of old junk.
Water. I'm thirsty. All right. All right. Where was I? All right. I got a USB drive that I needed for the 3D printing, and I got my water. And that's good enough.
rebuilt the chimney and installed a stove, repaired the roof, replaced and treated the rotten floors, dug up the workshop floor and moved soil away from around the sides of the building to help keep it dry. In this episode, I'll be completely renovating the woodshed, emptying out heaps of junk, getting rid of the monster ivy and replacing the roof before filling it up with wood for future projects.
Man, he's got some holes in his wall still.
To start with, I'll trim back the canopy of the ivy and cut the main stems, which will hopefully make it easier to peel the rest of the ivy off the building once it has begun to dry in the sun.
Yeah, I remember having to cut stuff like this in the not fields, freaking fence line at my house. It was not nearly that bad, but I just used a chainsaw, weeder attachment, and it took a few days. Oh, gross. So a little newt. And that looks like roofing shingles. I wonder if they're any good. Reminds me, stuff like this say, in Britain, 100 years isn't a long time, but 100 miles is a long distance. Kind of like U.S. is 100 years is a long time, but 100 miles is nothing. And apparently, a bunch of people like say it's true.
That was an absolute mission to get down. The weight of it is huge. It must have been, from a sort of loading perspective, way more than the roof was ever designed to hold, and hence it's just crumbled over time.
Makes me want to think. So, a 100-year-old place is fairly new compared to everything else in like Britain. It's neat that it takes that shape. I wonder how they get that tarnished look in the model. It's really cool for like a World War I abandoned building mini. I'm thinking, should I do some more 3D printing? Should I watch stuff? Or should I do some hands? I'm just kind of relax right now. I think it's pretty, but yeah, it's also like definitely not good. Ah, just put myself in the eye. Ouch. I'm guessing he doesn't have like power tools. It'll be a nice little shed once it's fixed up. Put a new roof on it, patch up the concrete, not concrete, the bricking, and insulate it real well and run some power to it. Could be a nice workshop. I wonder what that thing is over here.
This is really unstable. I've been wriggling away at the ivy on top and the whole wall wobbles. I might have to reinforce it before I go any further. I'll keep going for a bit and maybe try and reduce the weight and volume of the wood up there. But if it gets too bad, I will have to reinforce it before carrying on.
You said it's ivy, but I'm pretty sure that's trees as well. Or that's some really thick ivy. I'm gonna go ahead and take some melatonin so I can take a good old, sleep.
This thing, which just came down, is probably about as heavy as I am, and the thickest bit is about that, so good sort of 3-4 inches. Absolute beast of an ivy. Very good to get that down, and I'm not surprised at all that the building's cracked. This is where the ivy's got in and has sort of acted to pull the building apart, and then down here as well it's been pushing away. But I suspect the majority of the damage was done by the sheer weight of it on this corner.
That's impressive. Also, is that a gas cylinder that's just sitting right there? Looks pretty. I would like dry it out and like see if I can make it like table out of that.
The remaining roofing sheets here are acceptable. They're fine for lean-tos and log stores and things like that, so I'm going to try and take them off carefully. And in order to do that, I'm going to just nip the top off these with an angle grinder, and then they should just pull off neatly.
Oh, he does have power tools. Oh, that's not good.
Whilst the roof is off and there's good ventilation, I'll be trying to get rid of all of this loose paint.
It's lead.
Dusty bits. And the way I'm going to do that is use this angle grinder with this very harsh steel brush attachment. It works wonders, and I'm only going to be doing a light brush, not to get all the paint off, just to get the loose bits off.
That wall really irritates me. It's not, evenly cut. Or I guess it just all like corroded and broke away. Still sucks. I'm more impressed that it's not raining on him for Britain.
After a trawl of Facebook Marketplace, I'm up in London collecting some leftover corrugated sheeting and reclaimed 4x2 timber from an attic conversion project. The materials will be used for the new shed roof.
That's cool.
This wall is super unstable, so I'm going to start off by putting wall plates on, which are wooden bits which sit on the top of the wall, and that will help tie this together. And then once the roof is on, I will come back and repoint this crack, which should stabilise it further. It will certainly do the job, and it will be covered by some sort of barge board. Overall, it's fine for a shed. Structurally though, questionable.
Okay. Isn't that just drywall nail pieces? I don't see why it wouldn't work.
I've raised these wall plates up a little bit higher than they were originally, so as to allow for just that little bit extra headroom so that you don't have to feel like you'll have to duck the whole time. So this should do the trick nicely, and there we go. Just sort of eases underneath.
Yeah, in order to keep you back, you could just put a workbench right there so it keeps you a little bit further away from that so you don't hit your head. Big yawn. Ugh. I'm tired.
That's all I can do for today on the roof because I am out of long timbers. I'll be doing some more Facebook Marketplace foraging this evening and we'll be able to finish this tomorrow. In the meantime, I'm going to put a wooden surround round this window frame to make it easier to fix odd panes of glass in just temporarily.
It's just
We're due for
temporary.
some really heavy rain, so I've got about 6 hours to get this roof on. So rest of these rafters, then the corrugated sheeting on top. Hopefully that's enough time. If not, it's going to get wet in here.
I mean, it's only been getting wet for the past, what, 100 years? Actually, it's probably been more like 40 or 50.
I've got enough timber to have 4 battens which run in that direction, which will help support the corrugated steel, and it'll also mean that it'll make the roof marginally more rigid. The spacing between these rafters is quite large. I'm limited by the materials I've got. However, if there's too much deflection, then I will add some reinforcement as I get suitable timber.
Well, at least it's cleaning it up. That concrete, that hole still irritates me though.
So far, this roof is only attached in one location in that corner there, so that I can roughly fasten the sheets together and then rotate it round so that there is an even overhang along this front edge of the building. Because the building is very unlikely to be square, it's the most reliable way of getting this overhang to be uniform without getting steps in the sheeting at the front. The long ones are used for fixing down onto the battens, and then these short ones are used for tying the sheets together.
Oh yeah, it's snowing outside, so there's that going on, which is nice. If not cold. I always wonder what's the best way to like cut that. And I guess just an angle grinder works. Seriously, does that thing say candy?
The whole building
This
has
big
shifted over
stretch.
time, so the door frame is no longer fits. So I've got to pack out the gap, and then I will refasten it to the wall.
I found 3 cast iron windows which were originally installed in the main house over 100 years ago. They are nearly a perfect fit, so I'll give them a quick clean up and pop them in.
I don't even know why I'm watching this. It's just something that popped up in my autoplay, and I'm like, hey, maybe some people want to watch it. Yeah, I think it would be funny if something goes viral one of these days. So it's like, I just need like 2,000 more subscribers and 3 million views and a lot of people coming in, so I can like monetize my YouTube. Start making that money, and once you make that money, I can start with big projects. Well, funded through YouTube. I'm already doing my own big projects, but I want to do bigger. Like the car from Fallout 4, I want to 3D print that and build it, make it work. I want to print a semi-functional power armor from Warhammer, like not an actual like spacesuit one, but like, you know, a power armor, something that is an exoskeleton that somewhat works. And eventually build a 1-to-1 scale Imperial Knight that may or may not also actually walk. You could probably power it by diesel. They're big, giant robots. Are clunky, and they have huge exhaust ports. So you could probably actually make it run. Uh, just some hydraulics and maybe some computering. I really wonder if you could actually make it mostly mechanical. That way it can be repaired easily without needing to program. Yeah, and also be doing my Frankenstein's Army project in the background because apparently that's perfect for Trench Crusaders. Or Trench Crusade. Which makes sense. I mean, they are World War II. Frankensteinian creatures are made to kill and grow the army. That's smart with the reclaimed pallets, though. Ah, so he literally is just using it for wood. It's literally just the woodshed. Well, it is nice.
Assuming the root cause has been fixed, the correct way to repair such a large crack is to install Helifix stitching bars or to simply rebuild this section of wall. Given that this is just a single skin shed which will only be used for wood storage and will most likely only be standing for a few more decades, I decided to rely on the door frame and wall plates to resist tension, compression and torsion, and point the crack with lime mortar to resist compression.
Huh. I would have taken some, like, cords and pulled it together and, like, tried to stitch it together somehow, but with, like, maybe some metal rods. But also, this is a shed, and I would want to fill in every gap.
A massive thank you to everyone following this project and showing your support in the comments. And a very, very special thank you goes to all of you who joined
Alright. Let's see, where are we? Get rid of that. It's me. I'm exposed. There we go. Bomb witch, bomb witch, bomb witch. Alright, now, where are we? Right, let's get to it.
Echoes of the Tomb.
Oh, I already did that one.
Sector 13. Of all the worlds I've visited in my long and discreditable career, I suppose Kefia stands out as one of the most pleasant. In the abstract, at least, we were there to fight a war, don't forget, so there was plenty to keep the mind occupied. But in the main, I look back on my years there through a faint haze of nostalgia. Being an agri-world, the landscape was almost completely rural, so my overriding impression was one of endless plains of lush greenery cut across by isolated roads, which occasionally intersected at quaint rustic villages where nothing much seemed to have changed since the Emperor was in short trousers. The climate was pleasant too. The small ice caps trickling clear fresh water into all three continents from large polar mountain ranges, while the narrow equatorial band was mercifully free of any landmass worth fighting over. There were a few small island chains where tiny inbred communities fished and grew tropical fruit, but they were too insignificant to have attracted any enemy attention and were ignored by our side too after the initial sweeps. All in all, I was pretty pleased with life. My inadvertent heroism on Desolatia a couple of years before had won me a little notoriety among the Imperial Task Force, and I'd been able to capitalize on that quite nicely. Even after all this time, there were still sufficient senior officers and administratum functionaries wanting to shake my hand to keep me comfortably occupied, attending receptions and seminars far from the fighting, so that I frequently found myself away from my unit for days on end. A deprivation that Colonel Mostru, our commanding officer, bore with commendable fortitude, I have to say. Even while I was at my post, things were hardly onerous. The 12th Valhallan Field Artillery were parked well behind the lines, as you'd expect, so I'd had little occasion to face the enemy directly. Indeed, since we were engaged in a protracted campaign to cleanse the planet of a gene-stealer infestation, there was seldom anything to fire our guns at in any case. The war was a subtle one for the most part, a counterinsurgency and surgical strikes, with the enemy seldom massing in numbers sufficient to justify an artillery barrage. The occasional exceptions to this were renegade units of the local planetary defense force, which would turn out to be riddled with Steeler cultists with depressing regularity, and turn their guns on the guard or the local units sent to deal with them until our overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower had their inevitable effect. Like most agri-worlds, Kefir was sparsely populated by Imperial standards. This made our job of cleansing the place both easier and harder than it might have been. Easier, in that cities were few and far between. I think there were no more than a dozen on the entire globe, which meant that the dense concentrations of population Steeler cult needs to really take root and hide in were absent, but harder, in that the cult had instead become attenuated, spreading its tentacles widely in small pockets of infestation rather than remaining sufficiently concentrated to root out and destroy in a single strike. The upshot of all this was that we'd been forced into a protracted campaign, cleansing the world province by province, one brood at a time, and we'd already seen 3 winters come and go since we'd arrived here. Some, of course, found the slow pace of the campaign frustrating. Not least my crony and closest friend in the battery, Lieutenant Divas, who, as always, was chafing at the bit, eager to get the matter over with and move on to the next war. "We're making progress," I told him, uncorking the bottle of well-matured Amasec, which had somehow found its way into my kit bag after the last round of handshaking and finger food I'd been dragged off to. "Both the northern continents are completely clean already." "But they were only ever lightly infested to begin with," he rejoined, finding a couple of tea bowls in the clutter on my desk, which Jurgen, my aide, had failed to tidy up before disappearing on some mysterious errand of his own. "The majority of the Steelers were always down south of here. You know that." "Your point being?" I asked, pouring the amber liquid with care. Divas shrugged, looking uncannily like a bored child getting tired of the current amusement. "I don't know. We could be here for years yet if something doesn't change." "I suppose we could," I agreed, trying not to sound too pleased at the prospect. That would have suited me fine, my adventures with the Tyranids on Desolatia striking me as more than enough excitement for one commissarial career. Had I but known, of course, it had just been the prelude to a lifetime of narrow escapes from almost certain death. But back then, I had yet to develop the innate paranoia which was to serve me so well in my subsequent century of running for cover and shooting back when I couldn't avoid it. The prolonged period of relative quiet had lulled me into a false sense of security, which a few years later would have elicited nothing more than a vague sense of waiting for the other boot to drop. So as I poured the drinks, I had little inkling of the fact that the turning point of the entire campaign was no more than a few hours away, and that once again I would find myself caught up in the middle of events over which I had not the slightest control. The irony was that I'd had my chance to avoid it, but at the time I thought I was being remarkably prudent in not doing so. You see, Colonel Mostru had never quite shaken the feeling that I'd been less than honest about my supposed heroism on Desolatia, when my attempt to save my own neck had inadvertently stumbled across a swarm of Nids which would otherwise have annihilated us, and my subsequent panic dash back to our own lines had drawn them neatly into the killing zone of our guns. He'd never said anything directly about it, of course, but after that, he made a point of creating subtle opportunities for me to prove my mettle, which generally amounted to nudging me in the general direction of trouble and looking out for any overt sign of reluctance to put myself in harm's way again. Luckily, my side trips away from the battery had limited his opportunities for such amusements, but on a couple of occasions I'd been left with no alternative but to tag along with a forward observer unit with every outward show of enthusiasm, so as not to undermine my fraudulent reputation. As it turned out, these little expeditions hadn't been nearly as unpleasant as I'd anticipated. On each occasion, we'd taken some fire from the cultists as soon as they realized we were sitting out ahead of our own lines, calling in their positions to the battery, but to my well-disguised relief, the subsequent barrages had taken care of that before they got close or accurate enough to be a real nuisance. To all intents and purposes, they'd remained a distant threat, despite the occasional lasbolt putting a dent in the sandbags protecting us. Indeed, in all these minor engagements, I'd never even seen the enemy close enough to tell whether they were true hybrids or merely their human dupes. All that was about to change, though, when the Colonel stuck his head into my office the morning after my chat with Divis. "Commissar," he said, nailing me with those ice-blue eyes which always seemed to see a lot further into me than I was comfortable with.
The witch.
"Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I responded, with every sign of politeness, ignoring the faint throbbing of the Amasek hangover I brought into the room with me that morning. "Can I offer you some tea?" "Thank you, no." He moved aside hastily as Jurgen began to pour an extra bowl. I no need refuse, of course, which is why I'd offered. My aide was a splendid fellow in many respects, not the least of which was a singular lack of imagination that he compensated for with a deference to authority and a literal-minded approach to following orders which simplified my own life in many ways. But he was hardly the most prepossessing trooper in the guard, and apart from his habitual untidiness, his spectacular body odour meant that visitors were loath to linger in his general vicinity, certainly not for as long as it would take to drink a bowl of tanner leaf tea, one of the few Valhallan habits I've picked up from my prolonged association with the natives of that icebound world, by the way. It's made from a plant that grows in the caverns there, and it has a faintly bitter aftertaste I find most refreshing. "As you wish." I sipped at the fragrant liquid and raised an eyebrow in polite inquiry. "How can I help you?" "There's a briefing about the deployment of the garrison troops this afternoon at brigade headquarters," Mostru said, clearly fighting the impulse to back away from Jurgen. Unlike the Iceworlders I'd served with, I had my office and quarters open to the sweet spring breezes, instead of air-conditioned to the temperature of a meat locker, and he clearly found the relative warmth mildly uncomfortable, not least because it let my aide's distinctive bouquet flourish. Another good reason for leaving the windows open, of course. "I thought you might like to attend." And get palmed off on some risky reconnaissance mission to the battlefront as soon as we were there, no doubt. But I couldn't simply refuse. Inviting me to observe the peacekeeping arrangements for the newly cleansed continents on behalf of the Commissariat was a courtesy, at least on the surface, so I thought I'd better just accept, go along, and hope I could find some excuse to hang back when the danger presented itself. I was just opening my mouth to agree, inwardly cursing the Colonel, when Jurgen unexpectedly came to my rescue. "Begging your pardon, sir, but if you're going to be leaving the battery, you'd better reply to the Custodes first." "The Custodes?" Mostru's eyebrow rose in slightly exaggerated surprise. "Have you been up to something I should be concerned about?" Quite a bit, as it happened, but I wasn't about to tell him that. Instead, I picked up the data slate with the flashing red urgent icon Jurgen had placed on my desk, and which I hadn't been able to face looking at through the hangover until the tanner tea kicked in, and glanced at it briefly. "Not this time." I smiled too, so we could both pretend it was a joke, and nodded to Jurgen. "Thank you for reminding me." I turned back to the Colonel. "A few of our gunners are in civilian custody. It seems they got a little over-exuberant in one of the local hostelries last night." I sighed with carefully feigned regret. "So, pleasant as this little trip of yours sounds, I suppose I'll have to stay here and sort things out." "Of course." He nodded soberly, always a sucker for the duty-first routine, and for once I didn't have to stretch it. Discipline in the battery was definitely my responsibility, so I had the perfect excuse for sidestepping whatever little inconvenience he'd been planning to drop on me. Of course, if I'd known
Head
what sorting
to.
out that apparently trivial little piece of paperwork would lead to, I'd have gone with him like a shot and taken my chances, but then I'd never have cemented my reputation as a bona fide hero, and the war for Kefir would have taken another turn entirely. The nearest village to our artillery park, Pegas Parva, was about 20 minutes away, or 10, the way Jurgen drove, so I had little time to enjoy the fresh spring air as it wafted in across the kilometres of open fields that lined the road. I'd become quite familiar with the place in the past few months, so I was already well aware that it was somewhat larger than its name implied. It was the bureaucratic centre of the region, Sector 13 on the maps of the continent we've been supplied with by the local administratum, so boasted a handful of civic buildings as solid and imposing as the temples and libraries of far larger settlements. In peacetime, it had been home to some 2,000 souls, rather than the handful of hundreds in the surrounding villages, most of them engaged in supporting the scattered farmsteads which clustered around it in some way. But the upheaval of war and the arrival of so many guardsmen in the area with pay packets in need of emptying had almost doubled the population. It goes without saying that most of the new arrivals were supporting the war effort by maintaining morale among the troopers in ways which didn't entirely meet the approval of the long-term residents, or for that matter the local custodies, which had tripled its manpower over the last few months. That had sounded pretty impressive, until I'd realised all it meant was that the sector sergeant had been joined by a couple of resentful beat-pounders from the provincial capital, who had clearly been selected on the basis of whoever the authorities there had felt the city was most able to manage perfectly well without. The sergeant herself was another matter entirely, as I knew quite well, having taken care to establish good relations with the local custodies as soon as we were deployed in the region. And to my pleasant surprise, this had developed into rather more than a simple working relationship. Winifred Pooh was a solid career officer in her mid-30s, about a decade older than I was at the time, with a full figure which looked quite good in uniform, and even better out of it, as I discovered on a couple of occasions. She was good at her job, knew most of the locals by sight, if not by name and reputation, and had turned down the chance of promotion to more challenging duties in the city at least 3 times that I knew of, because she enjoyed the sense of being part of a close-knit rural community. Despite our friendship, she eyed me coolly as I entered the custodies post from which she exercised her stewardship of the scattered hamlets and villages of Sector 13. "You took your time," she said. I shrugged, smiling cordially for the benefit of her subordinates who were slouching around the place trying to look busy, and advanced through the colonnaded entrance hall of the sector house towards the high wooden counter, which barred the public from the working part of the building. "I know, my apologies." I adopted an expression of resigned good humour. "They keep us pretty busy in the guard, you know." "I can imagine. If the ones we've got downstairs are anything to go by." She prodded the rune, which retracted part of the counter, having recognised her thumbprint, and recoiled slightly as Jurgen followed me through the gap. The nearest constable's jaw dropped visibly as the gap closed behind us with a faint squeak of unoiled runners. "Who's this?" "My aide, Gunner Jurgen." I performed the traditional back-and-forth hand gesture which has accompanied informal introductions since time immemorial. "Jurgen, Sergeant Pooh of the Custodies." "Pleased to meet you, miss." He threw her a sloppy salute, which wasn't strictly necessary, what with her being a custodian and all, but to Jurgen, a sergeant was a sergeant, and that was that. Besides, she appreciated the courtesy and reciprocated with a nod. "Likewise." The pleasantry was reflexive, but Jurgen smiled broadly anyway, curdling the expression of the constable even more, if that were possible. Winifred appeared to notice him for the first time. Larrabee, go and collect the Commissar's men and sort out the charge sheets. Ma'am. He acknowledged her order with a manifest lack of enthusiasm that would have got any trooper in the guard a stiff talking to at the very least, and slouched off in the direction of the cells. You'd better go with him, I told Jurgen. Make sure they behave themselves. Sir? He trotted off behind the constable, who seemed to move a little faster as his new companion approached, leaving me alone with Winifred. I'd been hoping for a little friendly conversation, even a mild flirtation or two, but her mind was entirely on business that morning, and I had to make do with a smile and the offer of a mug of recaf. Let me guess, I said as I scanned the data slates and let them read my thumbprint to confirm that I'd taken charge of the recidivists in the name of the commissariat. Drunk and disorderly, lewd conduct, and a couple of brawls. Winifred's mouth quirked with what looked like genuine amusement. You obviously know your men well, she said dryly. She sipped her mug of recaf. I know these ones a bit too well, I said, scanning the 5 names, which between them made up a good 10% of my workload. That might not sound much to you, but in a battery of over 300 guardsmen, it was a pretty impressive achievement in its own way. Hoken, Nordstrom, Milson, Jarvik. And I raised my head to stare disapprovingly at the leading trooper as the small knot of men emerged sheepishly from the cells. And the inevitable Gunnar Elson. He grinned at me with the abashed expression I'd become all too familiar with over the last couple of years. Tell me, Elson, are you planning to make latrine orderly a full-time career? He shrugged. We serve the Emperor as our talents direct, he quoted, eliciting a handful of sniggers from among his compatriots. Where you're concerned, he delegates to me, I riposted. The custodians looked a little surprised at the informality of the exchange, but I felt no obligation to enlighten them. Elson had saved my life back on Desolatia, picking off a Tyranid gargoyle which was swooping on me from behind, and was under the fond illusion that I cut him a little more slack as a result. In actual fact, he was completely mistaken about this, but I did nothing to disabuse him or anyone else of the notion, being keenly aware that if the rest of the troopers believed that looking out for the Commissar's welfare would rebound to their own advantage, I stood a much better chance of enjoying a long and successful career. I swept an evaluating eye over the little knot of troopers. All right, Nordstrom, who started it? Of all of them, Nordstrom was visibly by far the worst for wear. The others might have been hungover still, but were at least able to function. Jarvik and Hoken had to hold him up between them, and he seemed to focus on the sound of my voice with a visible effort. I'm not sure, sir, he managed to slur after a moment. Is that what? Milson and Elson exchanged glances and sniggered. If anyone had more clearly been in a brawl, I had yet to meet them. Nordstrom's knuckles were bruised and bloodied, his face showing visible contusions, and as his torn, unfastened shirt swung open, I caught sight of a dressing patch at the bottom of his ribcage. Is that a knife wound? I asked, unable to keep a sudden flare of concern from my voice. If it was, the ensuing paperwork would take up the rest of the day, but Winifred shook her head. No, it's superficial. It was hardly even bleeding when we found him. And where was that? I asked. She shrugged. An alley off Harvest Street. No surprise there. It was right in the middle of the area most of the newer residents plied their trade in. A couple of square blocks of taverns, gambling dens and bordellos, which had sprung up like mushrooms in the shadow of the Agricultural Records Office, to the great discomfiture of the administratum adepts who worked there. At least so they said. It was those Grox fondlers in the Crescent Moon, Jarvik said. I bet you. The others nodded, muttering dangerously. They put something in your drink and rob you blind when you keel over. It sounded like nothing more than barrack room gossip to me, but Milson was nodding eagerly in agreement. It's true. They did the same thing to me a couple of weeks back. I glanced at Winifred, who shrugged. Wouldn't surprise me if he did get rolled, she said. We're always scraping drunken guardsmen off the streets around there, and they've usually been picked clean by the time we get to them. I wasn't drunk, Milson asserted vehemently. Well, not very, but not that much anyway. I know how to hold me ale. That much, at least, I knew to be true. Most of the entries in the voluminous file I had on him were for minor infractions involving civic property and small items he'd found lying around somewhere, rather than excessive intoxication. I returned my attention to Nordstrom. Nordstrom, I said slowly, trying to get him to concentrate. What's the last thing you remember? His brow furrowed. Go and fight. That much was obvious. And judging by the condition he was in, I'd be surprised if he remembered any of the details. But Winither pounced on the opening. Who with? Once again, Nordstrom's face contorted with the effort of thinking. "Dunno," he said at last. "Thawin?" How about before that? I suggested. This all seemed like a waste of time to me, but I suppose Winither had to at least make an effort to investigate what went on a few hundred meters from her sector house, and the longer I lingered, the more I could appreciate her company, and the more time there was for Mostru to leave for brigade headquarters without dragging me along to whatever little surprise he had planned. "There was a girl, wasn't there?" Milson interrupted. "With purple hair." I glared at him to try and shut him up, but Nordstrom was nodding. The ghost of a smile appeared on his face. "Guella." For a moment, a similar dreamy expression descended on Milson too. "Amazing tattoos." "I knew it." Milson looked triumphant. "The last thing I remember before coming round in the alley is buying her a drink." "Ring any bells?" I asked Winither, who was also nodding, but with purposeful recognition. "Sounds like one of the local Joy girls. Works out of the Crescent Moon." "There, that proves it," Yarvik said. He glanced meaningfully at his friends. "Someone should go around there and sort them out." It was pretty clear from the tone of his voice who he had in mind for the job. I had no objection to that in principle, having found other establishments more congenial for my own recreational purposes, but this was edging into the realm of things I didn't want to know about because they'd make my job more complicated if I did, so I cut in quickly before they said anything which sounded like a positive plan of action. After all, if I didn't know about any potential trouble, I could hardly be expected to head it off, could I? "I think we can safely leave that in the hands of the custodians," I said with all the authority I could muster. To his credit, Yarvik took the hint and shut up, although I would have laid a small wager that the next time I came to town, I'd find the Crescent Moon's windows boarded up at the very least. "Worth shaking the tree, I suppose," Winither said to my vague surprise. She looked at the constable she'd addressed before. "Larrabee, keep an eye on things while I'm gone." She gestured to her other colleague, whose name I never caught, with a brusque jerk of her head. "You're with me." After a pace or two, she paused and smiled at me. "Commissar, it was one of your men who made the complaint after all." I was a little taken aback, I don't mind admitting. And had I realized what I was letting myself in for, I would have loaded my collection of defaulters aboard the truck outside and headed back to the battery as fast as I could and taken my chances with Mostru.
Once this
But
is done,
it
I'm
seemed like a
gonna
harmless
head
enough
on
way
to
of
bed. I
wasting a
am
couple of hours on a
tired.
pleasant spring morning, and there was always the possibility of a little time alone with Winither, so I found myself nodding in agreement. "Good idea, Sergeant. It'll save us having to bounce reports and data files off each other for the rest of the week." I glanced disapprovingly at the little group of dishevelled gunners. "And give Nordstrom a chance to pull himself together before we leave." I could see from the covert glances that the troopers exchanged I'd done the right thing there, reinforcing my carefully constructed facade of being firm but fair. Then I strolled out of the building to join Winither, savouring the sweet spring sunshine for the last time that day. The Crescent Moon was a seedy-looking establishment at the best of times, which was after dark with the flare of pink and blue luminators flashing to lure the indiscriminating customer inside. In daylight, it looked even worse. The peeling paint on the shutters and crumbling plascrete of the facade was a foretaste of the cheap wooden furnishings and even cheaper liquor on sale inside. There were some suspicious-looking stains on the pavement next to the waste bins that I took pains to give a wide berth to as Winither hammered on the door with the butt of her las pistol. "Custodians, open up!" she yelled, with surprising volume for a woman so small. After a few seconds of nothing happening, she repeated the procedure, attracting the attention of a small gaggle of passing administratum drones that glanced at us
Big yawn.
furtively and started muttering to each other that it was about time somebody did something about that dreadful place. The door remained resolutely shut. "Oh dear, there doesn't seem to be anyone in," Winifred said loudly, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. She turned to the constable, who had drawn his own sidearm with an anticipatory glint in his eye. "We'll have to blow the hinges off." Someone had evidently been listening, because there was a sudden rattling of bolts, and the door creaked open slightly to reveal an unhealthy-looking individual in badly fitting clothes and a barman's apron, which might originally have been some kind of colour under its patchwork of stains. "Oh, wait, my mistake." "Yes," the man said, his hunched posture making his ingratiating tone sound even more insincere than it undoubtedly was. "How can I help you, officers?" His voice trailed off uncertainly as he caught sight of me for the first time. Whatever he'd been expecting, an Imperial Guard commissar certainly wasn't it. "And Commissar?" "Caiaphas Kane." I introduced myself, hoping that something of my reputation had preceded me, a pretty safe bet given the number of guardsmen among the clientele. A slight widening of his eyes suggested that it had indeed done so, but before I could capitalize on it, Winifred took charge again. "Kamala Dobrovelski, we want a quiet word." Winifred pushed past him without ceremony. "She works here, right?" "Yes, she does." The barman scuttled after us, agitation oozing from every pore. "But the management is in no way responsible for any actions by members of staff which contravene—" "Shut it!" The new voice confused me for a moment, until I realized the constable had spoken. Until then, I'd vaguely assumed he was mute. "Just tell us where she is." "Upstairs." The barman's eyes were fixed on the las pistols in the hands of the two custodians. I glanced around, finding nothing that looked like a threat. The establishment was as shabby as I'd anticipated, looking more like a downhive drinking den than something you'd expect to find on an agri-world. But I guess their customers weren't paying for sophisticated decor. "Thank you. Your cooperation has been noted," Winifred said dryly. We left the barman goggling after us and headed for the door in the back of the room with a crudely lettered sign stapled to it saying "Staff Only." Behind it, a corridor led to the back of the building, presumably to a storage area, and, judging by the smell, either a kitchen or a waste dump. In a place like that, it was hard to tell the difference, along with a rickety flight of stairs which ascended sharply to the left. "This must be it," I said. Winifred agreed and led the way up the stairs, which ran into a corridor running the length of the building, lined with simple wooden doors. The three of us looked at each other and shrugged. "One at a time?" I suggested. "No need." Winifred jerked a thumb at the door to a nearby room a few meters along from us. It had a small ceramic plate adhering to it, with a picture of a fat pink pony in a ballet dress, and Kamala's room written underneath in wobbly letters that were presumably supposed to look like they'd been done in crayon. This must be it. Before I could say anything humorous about her powers of deduction, she turned suddenly and kicked the thin wooden panel from its hinges. A feminine shriek of surprise and outrage confirmed that we'd found our quarry, and the constable and I followed the sergeant quickly through the wreckage of the door. "Kamala Dobrovelski?" she asked, although the question was only a formality. The girl sitting up in the rumpled bed matched Milson's description perfectly. Purple hair tumbling around a narrow face, twisted with shock and anger. "Get some clothes on. You're coming with us." "What for?" She began to comply with ill grace, revealing a body entwined with tattoos of a strange but compelling design, just as Nordstrom had said. Despite myself, I couldn't resist studying them, taking in how they accentuated the curves of her body, and as I did so, I felt the palms of my hands beginning to tingle. Always a reliable warning from my subconscious that something isn't quite right.
For the files.
She looked up and glared at me. "Enjoying the view, Caiaphas?" "I didn't know you'd met," Winifred said, switching her attention to me, her tone the temperature of a Valhallan midwinter morning. "We haven't," I said. The faint narrowing of the Joy Girl's eyes as I spoke was enough to tell me that she realized the slip of the tongue had just given her away, And now that the subconscious hint I'd noticed before was hammering against my forebrain, it was obvious there was something not quite right about her musculature, which the tattoos were designed to obscure.
Oh
But
boy.
I did tell the barman my name. I began to draw my chainsword. And stealers communicate telepath. With an inhuman screech, Camilla sprang from the bed, faster than I would have believed possible, barging into the constable who was still blocking the doorway. He tried to bring up his sidearm, but was too close. Camilla's jaw elongated somehow,
there they
revealing
are.
a mouthful
Okay.
of razor-sharp fangs which clamped down on his throat, shearing through flesh and cartilage and decorating the shabby room with a bright spray of crimson. "Emperor on earth!" Winitha snapped off a shot, the lasbolt punching a hole through the shoddy partition wall next to its head as the shrieking hybrid turned from the spasming body of the constable back towards us. Beyond it, I could hear feet in the corridor outside. Even though I couldn't see the owners, the sound had a peculiar scuttling quality which raised the hairs on the back of my neck. The chainsword cleared the scabbard, and I swung it desperately as Camilla leapt again. "It's a whole nest of them!" I parried a strike from a hand tipped with talon-like fingernails, feeling the blade bite through chitinous skin, and ducked as those murderous jaws snapped closed a handspan from my face. Winitha fired again, and for a moment I thought she'd missed, until I realized she was holding off the rest of the brood. Clearly I'd have to finish this on my own. I swept the humming blade back in a counterstrike, taking the hybrid in the thorax and severing the spinal column. Foul-smelling ichor gushed, reminding me uncomfortably for a moment of the gaunts I'd faced on Desolatia, and the thing that had called itself Camilla dropped at my feet. "We're boxed in!" Winitha yelled. It certainly looked that way. The narrow cubicle was windowless, the only doorway crowded with horribly distorted parodies of humanity howling for our blood. She was placing her shots with care, picking off any foolish enough to show themselves directly with lasbolts to the head or chest, and pumping rounds through the thin wall from time to time to keep them from rushing the narrow space. I glanced around, a desperate plan beginning to form in my head. "Keep them off as long as you can," I yelled, swinging the humming blade at the thin wooden wall separating us from the adjoining cubicle. It bit hungrily, whining loudly as wood chips sprayed the room, and in seconds I'd carved a hole large enough to accommodate us. I jumped through, holding my humming weapon up ready to block an attack from the other side of the wall as I emerged, but the room beyond turned out to be unoccupied. And Golden Throne be praised, bright morning sunshine illuminated a shabby bedroom almost identical to the one we'd just left through a window so grubby it might almost have been opaque. Nevertheless, it was the work of a moment to smash the glass with the pommel of the chainsword and dive through, heedless of the drop beyond, while Winitha sent a fusillade of parting shots through the gap behind us to delay our pursuers. I hit the pavement hard, heedless of the jolt that drove the breath from my lungs, relaxing to absorb the impact with the instinct hammered into me by years on the assault courses of the Schola Progenium, and turned, drawing my own las pistol. A moment later, Winitha hit the ground beside me, and I peppered the window above us with vindictive enthusiasm, blowing the head off a thick-set male from his shoulders. As he fell, I noticed a third arm growing from his right shoulder, tipped with razor-sharp talons. "How many of these freaks are there?" I asked rhetorically, as the barman who'd let us in emerged from the door and levelled a stubber at us. Winitha took him down with a snapshot to the gut before he could fire, and we looked at one another with grim understanding sparking between us. "More than we can handle." More of the grotesques were emerging from the shadows of the alleyways, moving with a coordinated purpose that was all the more unnerving for taking place in complete silence. With a chill which raised the hairs on my neck, I realized that there were normal-looking humans among them too. Carriers of the gene-stealer taint, doomed to birth more of these monstrous hybrids with their wills already warped by the telepathic influence of the brood.
That's
I
never
recognized one of the Administratum drones who'd passed us earlier, a piece of piping in his hands, advancing on us with murder in his eyes, a chilling contrast to the prissy bureaucrat of a few moments before. "Pull back," I suggested, suiting the action to the word and sprinting in the direction of the sector house, drawn to the promise of protection beneath the spreading wings of the Aquila on the facade like a penitent to the confessional. Not that I've been anywhere near one since the Schola kicked me out, and I hardly ever told the truth in one while I was there, but you know what I mean. Winitha was with me, stride for stride, and our las pistols cracked in unison, striking down the cultists who were angling across the mouth of the street to cut us off. She activated her personal vox as we ran. "Larrabee, break out the weapons, we're coming in hot." All I could hear of the reply was the faint echo of static that told me her earpiece was activated, but her expression was enough to keep me appraised of the other end of the conversation. "We've uncovered a stealer cult. Inform the divisional office and the local guard units." Her voice caught for a moment. "No, he's dead. Just me and the commissar." I missed the next exchange because I was busy ducking a frenzied rush from a hybrid wielding a length of chain. I blocked it with a chainsword, slicing it through, and riposted with a desperate swing that took his head off. Good thing, too. It was remarkably ugly, with far too much tongue. When I regained my balance, Winitha was looking at me. "Are your men reliable?" Well, that was debatable, really, but under the circumstances, I'd expect them to act like the soldiers they were, so I just nodded. Winitha activated her vox again. "Arm the troopers." A pause. "I don't care how hungover they are, even if all they can do is remember which way to point a gun, they're better than nothing." "They'll do a lot better than that," I said, stung at the implied slur on the men I served with. True, they were rear echelon warriors rather than frontline fighting troops. Give them an earthshaker or two and they'd flatten a city block neat as you please, but small arms weren't really their speciality. On the other hand, they practiced assiduously on the shooting range. Mostru saw to that, as he did every other regulation, and Earlson at least was a pretty fair marksman, as I could attest from the mere fact that I was still breathing. And don't forget they'd fought off the Nids on Desolatia, so even if they weren't exactly battle-hardened veterans, they'd already proved they could fight up close and personal if they needed to. So, all in all, I felt pretty confident in their abilities. "I hope so." Winitha took down the last of the cultists between us and the sector house, and we started across the open square towards it. Our boot soles rang on the flagstones, echoes rising from the facades of the encircling administratum blocks, and small chips of stone began to kick up around us, preceded by the distinctive crack of ionized air which accompanies a las weapon discharge and the deeper bark of a stubber or two. Despite myself, I turned to look behind us, loosing off a couple of shots myself in the vague hope of keeping our assailants' heads down, then redoubled my efforts to reach the sector house. My worst fears had been realized. The cultists had been joined by a handful of men in the uniform of the local militia who were armed with standard-issue lasguns, and several of the hybrids had produced personal firearms of one kind or another. There were more of them than I could have dreamed possible, dozens of twisted monstrosities crowding into the square from all directions, converging on us with a grim fixity of purpose that clenched my bowels. "Militia renegades!" I gasped, feeling the air begin to rasp in my lungs. I couldn't keep this pace up for much longer, but to falter meant being torn apart by the mob of inhuman hybrids behind us. They surged on like a malevolent tide, untiring and implacable, uncannily reminiscent of the tyrannid swarms that had forged their foul purpose and sent them out to infiltrate the Imperium. "This is just getting better and better," Winitha smiled grimly and dropped one of our leading pursuers. The others didn't even falter, flowing around it like water around a rock. Another group was just clearing the corner of the sector house, angling in to cut us off from our refuge. A lasbolt, more accurate than the rest, caught the hem of my greatcoat, tugging at it like an importunate child. "Aim for the shooters," I counselled. If we couldn't at least throw their aim off, they'd have us cold in seconds. If they'd been proper guard troopers, we'd have been dead already, of course, and I found myself thanking the Emperor for the habitual sloppiness of the planet's defense force, which, like most professional soldiers, I usually found so irritating. Especially while trying to coordinate with them on the battlefield. It went without saying that on the few occasions we'd been forced to cooperate with the local forces, Colonel Mostru had been only too pleased to delegate this onerous task to me, and I'd had no choice but to comply with as much good grace as I could muster. Of all the varied duties of a commissar, I've always found liaising with local militia among the most irritating. We turned in unison, aiming as best we could, but under the circumstances I didn't expect much. At the very best, we were only delaying the inevitable until our pursuers closed. But I've always found that when you truly believe you only have seconds left to live, each one becomes so precious you become determined to eke them out for as long as possible, whatever the cost. We fired as one, expecting little effect, but to my astonishment, the renegade troopers were falling, breaking, and running for cover. "Cowards!" I bellowed, carried away with adrenaline and the reckless bravado of imminent death. "Stand and fight like men, damn you!" "Are you mad?" Winitha was staring at me in astonishment, and I whipped my chainsword up into a defensive posture, ready to take on the first wave of hybrids that was already leaping towards us, inhuman jaws agape. "Run, you idiot!" Only then did I realize that several of our would-be assailants were falling, bloody craters exploding across their chests, and the distinctive crack of lasfire was coming from behind us now. Instinct took over once again, and I followed her advice, finding the square behind us littered with the corpses of the cultists who had tried to cut us off. "This way, Commissar! Hurry!" Jurgen's familiar voice urged me on, and as I looked up at the sector house, now tantalizingly close, I caught sight of him crouched behind one of the columns supporting the portico, a lasgun raised and spitting death at the horde of cultists behind us. A moment later, I noticed another muzzle flash and made out Erlson similarly positioned, picking off one target after another with smooth precision. He caught sight of me and grinned, no doubt enjoying himself hugely. Larrabee was by the doors, the blue of his custodes uniform standing out starkly against the rich polished wood, blazing away on full auto without even the pretense of expertise. But the crush of distorted bodies was so great, aiming wasn't strictly necessary. Wherever he pointed his weapon, hybrids and human cultists alike fell like wheat before harvesters. With Jurgen's encouragement ringing in my ears, I put on a final spurt, vaguely surprised to find that a small part of my mind was still able to appreciate the rear view of Winitha bounding up the steps a few meters ahead of me. And then, almost before my senses could register it, I was surrounded by the cool marble foyer of the sector house. I turned back to find Larrabee closing the doors, while Jurgen and Erlson backed through them, still firing on the frenzied mob, which was by now cresting the steps outside and bounding over their fallen comrades in a single-minded attempt to reach the narrowing gap. They almost made it at that. The door stopped, centimeters from closing, blocked by a chitinous arm, tipped by 3 scythe-like talons, which gouged a deep groove from the thick hardwood as it flailed around for purchase. The 2 gunners leapt to assist the constable, putting their shoulders to the wood, but even with all 3 of them straining every muscle, the sheer weight of the tide of bodies behind it began to force the doors open again. I slashed down with the humming chainsword, severing the obscene limb that dropped to the floor, thrashing and leaking foul-smelling ichor, and the door slammed to. Larrabee triggered the locking mechanism, and thick steel bolts slammed home, securing it behind us. "What the hell did you think you were playing it at there?" Winitha was glaring at me, a complex mixture of emotions on her face. "Were you trying to get yourself killed?" There was no point in admitting I'd been so far gone I hadn't even noticed our comrades had opened up a corridor to safety for us, so I just shrugged. "Well, you know," I said, "ladies first." The effect was quite gratifying, I have to say. She hugged me briefly, failing to find any words, and turned away, already assessing our situation like the professional she was. Erlson and Larrabee were looking at me with undisguised admiration, and I was suddenly sure, correctly as it turned out, that suitably embroidered reports of my gallantry and heroism would be all over the sector before the week was over. I turned to Jurgen, who was taking in the scene outside with his usual phlegmatic manner. "What's our situation?" I asked. "Fracked," Erlson muttered, before turning back to...
Alright, all. That is, what was it? Tired, sleepy. Part 5. Alright, so next time it'll be part 6. Thank you all for stopping by the stream tonight. I will see y'all next time.